Therapists of Reddit, at what moment did you realize that your client couldn't be helped? A family member was dropped by their therapist because of constant lying. Basically, this family member, who is an incredibly toxic individual, played the victim to her therapist and then encouraged them to speak to her adult children, assuming that the therapist would take her side and tell the children how horrible they have been. Needless to say, the therapist got the truth from the children and sent a letter stating that they could no longer meet with the family member, going so far as to encourage them to seek inpatient treatment. Some of these responses, I doubt, are coming from therapists, so I will try to answer as clearly as I can. The first answer is, if they clearly don't want to help themselves, therapists can guide you, provide a useful and objective outside perspective, help you reframe your experiences, and can provide tools to help you direct your energy and thoughts. But we cannot do anything for you. We cannot start or end relationships for you. We cannot make you take your medication, or force you to cease any of your destructive habits, or practice new beneficial habits. Those are your decisions, and I cannot make any of them for you, even when to me the consequences of those decisions are clear. The second answer is, when I'm not the right therapist for this client, there are many reasons why I may not be the right therapist. I have my own style of communication, my own values, and my own personality, and those may not work with a certain client. I have had little success with certain clients who I have sent to other therapists and they have done well. Similarly, I have taken on clients who were frustrated with their past therapists and I have worked well with them. The last answer is, when the client's pathology requires intense or medical intervention. Therapy cannot substitute for inpatient care when that is needed, and therapists cannot prescribe medication even when that would help. Unfortunately, inpatient care is always in short supply and many clients resist that idea, and you often have to advise them that they cannot see you until they complete an inpatient course of treatment. I have to be very clear here. The dramatic statement "a therapist said I was too messed up to be helped" is often what clients hear, frequently because it advances their specific narrative, when we will always try to help, even if it means asking them to see another therapist or pursue another course of treatment. The analogy I use is that most mechanics can work on most cars. But if you have an unusual foreign car, you'll probably get better results finding a mechanic with more experience working on that brand. I cannot help you is not the same as you cannot be helped. When the child is younger than 8 to 9 years old and the parents want me to only work with the kid to change the kid's behavior, ain't gonna happen. You change the environment and parenting, and then you see changes in the kid's behavior. I am not saying it is the parents' fault or that they are the cause. I am saying that to work with kids who are young, you need to change the parenting and environment. Examples: autism and ADHD, not caused by the parents, but effective therapy requires changes to the environment, increases in prompts for warning, cues, help with regulating emotional and sensory responses. After the brain matures, some kids can better take perspective and think socially with help. A little later they can better plan ahead for contingencies, though the frontal lobes won't fully mature until a much later point in development than that which I was referring. I had a therapist send me a very kindly worded letter that told me she couldn't see me anymore until I found a way to remember appointments and show up. 3 months later I called and said I found a way to remember and I wanted to try again. She took me back and I never missed another appointment. Doing that was crucial. I needed to make therapy a priority for it to help. If I hired a personal trainer but never showed up or never did any exercise, then even the best personal trainer could not help me. A therapist is a personal trainer for the mind. They can't actually fix or do any of the work. They can only suggest work or help their client choose work to do. The client can't be passive. They must do work. This happened with my brother. My mom signed him up for much needed therapy, and he went for about a month or so before coming home very angry one day and saying he was never going back. My mom talked to the therapist, and she couldn't really tell any details for confidentiality reasons, but the gist basically seemed to be that she spent the month listening to him and trying to get him to think about things on a deeper level, and when she finally started outlining things from an outside perspective that didn't align with his, he got very angry with her. He quite literally couldn't handle the truth. My sister was let go by her therapist because she was lying to him constantly. He told my dad the therapy was a waste of money as long as she wasn't prepared to face her issues. It's been about 20 years since then, and she is still a train wreck. I consequently started seeing him a few years later for depression, and he was wonderful. I didn't want medication, so he didn't recommend starting any, and the CBT was really what I needed to get out of the thought cycle I was in. Once we both felt like I was in a good place and had developed the tools I needed, he let me go. Great guy, that really helped me. I was let go by a therapist. I was being treated for depression by my university psychologist. In actuality, I was bipolar, and yet to be diagnosed, I was coping in every possible unhealthy way: self-harm, alcohol, binging/purging, etc. The university wasn't set up for long-term care, so after a certain number of sessions she had referred me to an outside psychiatrist, but it was a terrible experience and I went back to her. She told me that she couldn't keep seeing me for her own mental health. She had become so concerned for me that it was affecting her. It was incredibly hard to hear, like I'm so messed up I even disturb a professional, but mental health professionals are people too, and I understand why. Not a therapist, but I cleaned house bi-weekly for an absolutely wonderful woman for a few years. She was actually one of my professors in college for a couple literature classes, and during that time she was going through a pretty severe battle with depression. She was seeing a therapist on a regular basis, but one day, when I came over, she said her therapist had let her go. When I asked why, she said she was told it was because she smelled like mold, and it was disrupting her therapist's respiratory system, which they claimed took them at least a day to bounce back from. Needless to say, she sank a bit deeper into her depression, and it took a few months before she had the gumption to try and meet another therapist. Not once did I ever catch even a whiff of something nasty, mold or otherwise, not on her, or in her house, or in her car. I'm a pretty detailed cleaner too. I take covers off of air vents and stick the vacuum hose down there, pull out drawers and clean all the crumbs out of the corners. It was hard not to take a tiny bit of offense myself, and it's not even my house. It so obviously deeply upset her, and made it much more difficult for her to battle with her depression, not to mention how much more vulnerable she must have felt seeking further help elsewhere. I still want to rage punch our old therapist just thinking about it, and it's been close to 4 years. I had a therapist tell me I was better and drop me when I was going through one of the worst moments in my life. After seeing her for 1.5 years, she was the director of a psychiatric ward at a local hospital and did therapy as a side gig to feel like she was making a direct impact. She would constantly interrupt me and tell me that she couldn't relate due to her happy childhood. She would get frustrated when one session on a topic wouldn't fix lifelong trauma. She even went so far as to say that she wouldn't touch some of my issues because I clearly wasn't going to get better, even though those issues were nowhere near as serious as some other things we covered. Looking back, she clearly was doing therapy as a way to make herself feel better, and not seeing immediate results was frustrating her because it wasn't this fun, feel-good side gig that she wanted. 2 months after being dropped, I had a serious panic attack and ended up finding another therapist who was a much better fit. I've made more improvement in the past 6 months with this therapist than the entire time with my previous therapist, and I'm so much happier now. It goes to show that therapists really need to be the right fit. 1 month in with this couple, a wife had just spent 5 minutes explaining the impact of her husband's language on her and how devalued, disregarded, and unimportant she felt in the relationship. His response to her was to, verbatim, use the exact language she had just described to respond to her. She collapsed into sobs, and he sat back, sighed, rolled his eyes, and gestured vaguely to her, as if I would agree that she's the problem. I told him exactly the opposite. He stormed out. She went to the lawyer I recommended and cleaned him out. Full custody too. It was truly a happy ending. Emotional abuse is still abuse, folks. When people endorse abuse in an intake session, we do not proceed. If they endorse abuse later, we do not proceed. If I have my suspicions, but there isn't an endorsement or any concrete evidence, I take the opportunity to build enough evidence to label it and build rapport with the victim to eventually educate them and provide them with the resources they need to exit safely if they want to leave. The struggle with emotional and/or psychological abuse, as opposed to physical abuse, is that victims of emotional abuse are far more often in denial. They often cannot label the behaviors accurately, because after months or years of being gaslit, they no longer trust their recollection. Because no one is being hit, a client must understand what emotional abuse is to identify it as abuse. That doesn't always happen, especially when we take into consideration the impact of culture and socioeconomic status on a person's social expectations. What is intolerable to some is status quo for others as therapists. We live in the in-between. Furthermore, many people that present with emotionally abusive behaviors are often functioning in fight/flight/freeze as the result of their own trauma. The vast majority of intermittently abusive suicidals can and do change with the appropriate support and boundaries. During session, I've seen it, I've lived it, and it's beautiful. When the attempt to educate and set boundaries fails horribly, we do not proceed, which is exactly what happened here. The client storming out and leaving only beat me to it. Another session would not have been scheduled regardless. The point is, it's easy to say therapy never works for abusive relationships, but how this boundary is actually executed, and when it's drawn, is an entirely different story.